In the 1950s and 60s, cancer was a word that was never mentioned. The idea of having something called cancer, it was so mysterious, so dangerous, so frightful, you could not mention cancer. Memorial Sloan Cancer Center in New York City was the pioneer in introducing the word cancer to be able to be used. But most everywhere else, not even oncology, we had to dodge around the term.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm Cindi Cantril, one of the Oncology Nursing Society's founding board members and the Society's first vice president. And today we are talking with Dr. George Hill, an oncologist who supported the Oncology Nursing Society's establishment and development leading up into its incorporation in 1975. About the organization's vibrant history, he is going to give us some poignant thoughts and his thoughts into the establishment and formation of ONS and what its past has been and what the future holds. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for agreeing to do this very, very, very important interview. When we look at the formation of ONS and its incorporation in 1975, many things led up to the formation and the development of oncology nursing. And looking into the past with respect to other organizations, for example, the American Society of Therapeutic Radiology and Oncology started very early, much earlier even than ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And what I'm mindful of is that the National Cancer Act in 1971, I believe, infused most of the funding into establishment of the clinical trials. So from your perspective, do you think that the emergence of ONS was really dependent, if you will, on that initial funding with respect to nurses starting to work in clinical trial world, or what are your thoughts?
Well, there's no doubt that the National Cancer Act elevated the whole field of oncology into something that was very different. Money does make a difference, and I can still remember seeing President Nixon in San Diego when he announced the formation of the National Cancer Act. I happened to be lucky to be present at that time. But actually, the reason that oncology nursing developed at the moment that it did was from you and the other few people who were real leaders in your field. It would not have happened then. It might have happened later, but it happened at that particular moment because of you and the other three. It took 2 years after your first meeting until you became incorporated. One of the greatest honors that I ever received was honorary membership in the ONS, and that certificate is right on the wall above me right now, and I look at it every day, every minute. It's been a great pleasure. But we are partners. We were partners right from the start. It was really a terrific thing. The nursing group that formed the ONS were all involved with the cooperative cancer treatment groups. You and I were involved with the Central Oncology Group, which was headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin. It was where I learned what nurses could do with doctors. They work as a team. Each had their jobs. The doctor was the principal investigator, and in that sense, the boss, but it was not really. It was a team. Others who led the original founding were in the National Surgical Adjuvant Breast Project, Dr. Bernie Fisher and his nurse, and the Southeastern Oncology Group, John Durant, and his nurse, who I believe was
Connie Henke Yarbrough.
Yes, Connie Yarbrough, and I worked with them. They moved back to Missouri. So all of us, all across the country, were part of the same group of people interested in new drugs for cancer. Our drug in Denver and in St. Louis was, our most important drug was doxorubicin for melanoma. And you mentioned in our conversation earlier, streptozotocin was a unique drug also, but not used very much, but it was a challenge. And of course, adriamycin, we talked about that before the podcast. Adriamycin was a dramatic new drug that came in the 1970s from Gianna Bonadonna, named adriamycin for the Adriatic Sea, of course, in the Mediterranean. And all of that fitted together in such a beautiful way. And it has moved forward in such a beautiful way. Unexpectedly, I had no idea what oncology nursing would be. And my favorite reading in medical things is the Oncology Nursing Journal. I've gotten it now for 25 years, and I have the latest one right beside me here. There's an article in it on its prevention of nasty things from toilet splashes. Now, all sorts of wonderful things, but I appreciate that because, once again, it's nursing business. I was hospitalized with pneumonia 3 years ago, and the nurses would come in and listen to me telling stories. I can tell stories. And they listened to me telling stories, and they took care of me, and they maybe gave me some special care and so forth. But I learned also about some other things about nursing, and I learned about the splashing toilets. So anyhow, my nursing career has been a bystander, but it's been very interesting. And once again, congratulations, ONS.
Yes, the 50th anniversary is coming up soon. It's been a wonderful, wonderful evolution in terms of nursing. Tell me a little bit about the surgeons actually physically administering chemotherapy well before we knew the specialty of medical oncology. So how was that for you as a surgeon to actually administer chemotherapy, and who mentored you in doing that? How did you come about those skills?
Well, in the first place, surgeons have to be good with their hands. You don't have to have any special training to use your hands. You're selected because you have that ability. It's interesting, some of the earliest cancer drugs were actually given by pediatricians. And surgeons and pediatricians worked together with pediatric oncologists in the first real successes in cancer chemotherapy. And that honestly is what drove me into the field. The treatment of teratocarcinomas and of the kidney, cures actually with drugs, and then the anti-leukemic drugs. And those were given mostly by what you call internists. They were pediatricians, not surgeons. But surgeons participated in the care, especially the rhabdomyosarcomas. So we were involved with it, but because we could use our hands, we were right there ready to participate. At that time, internists, hematologists, most of them would have nothing to do with it because the success rate until 5-fluorouracil was developed at the University of Wisconsin, the success rate with chemotherapy in adults was very poor. The only drug really that worked at all was a terribly dangerous drug, nitrogen mustard. It worked for a few cancers, but it was terribly poisonous and very difficult, very marginal. It happens, I'm just thinking now of how important it is to have nurses trained, because one of my patients at the University of Colorado was on the research ward, and I ordered a nitrogen mustard, and the pharmacy made a mistake in the decimal point. They missed the decimal point, and they gave 10 times as much in bottles. And I happened to walk onto the ward just as the nurse was about to start giving 10 bottles instead of one to the patient. And, she had no training in oncology. The pharmacy made a terrible mistake, and she would have killed the patient if I hadn't walked right onto the floor at that particular moment. So that's the kind of the margins that we travel on with these dangerous drugs. Enough said for now. Near enough question, Cindi.
Looking at cancer care in general, in the 70s, many people, it was still something that people didn't disclose. I remember specifically patients saying she wanted to have a garage sale. I said, what did you want to do before you were admitted to the hospital? She said, well, I was going to have a garage sale. And I said, well, why can't we start to look at that when you're discharged? And she said, because nobody would buy my clothes. I didn't understand. So can you speak to me a little bit about how cancer was viewed socially before even the 70s? Some of our founding nurse leaders, the real true trailblazers, Virginia Barkley, and some of the other nurses talked about the shame for many of the public health nurses were going into people's homes, and it was like a very hidden disease. So can you speak to that a little bit?
It's fascinating, Cindi. In the 1950s and 60s, cancer was a word that was never mentioned. The idea of having something called cancer ward, Solzhenitsyn wrote a book about entitled Cancer Ward. It was so mysterious, so dangerous, so frightful, you could not mention cancer. Memorial Sloan Cancer Center in New York City was the pioneer in introducing the word cancer to be able to be used. But most everywhere else, not even oncology, nobody would understand what oncology was anyway, but we had to dodge around the term. And you and I did that. You remember the day that you went to see a patient and you reported back that he got his nature back. He was on prostate cancer hormone therapy, but you encouraged him, and he found a way. And also, remember in St. Louis City Hospital, when we went visiting patients, follow-up, you told us, stand back from the door, knock on the door, and then stand aside, because you never know, they'll take a shot through the door. It was dangerous country.
We were doing home visits, yeah.
Home visits has nothing to do with cancer, but these are old stories that I can remember from 50 years ago. But certainly cancer was a disease that had to be introduced with some benefit in order to be able to talk about it and then build on the conversations to get people to accept the fact, at least children to accept the fact that their parents had some sort of disease, a problem that they could treat. And so it becomes a matter of the whole family being involved and the family accepting the issue, and then we go ahead with the treatment. But it does help. The treatment does work. In the days when there was nothing but surgery, mutilating surgery, it was pretty hard. And thank goodness that radiation was there, even 250 kV radiation that your husband's father headed in Astro. 250 kV radiation at least did something. The alternative was gigantic surgery, pelvic regeneration, radical mastectomy, that sort of thing. Thank goodness for chemotherapy and immunotherapy.
So with the emergence of the Association of Community Cancer Centers, which I think was really clearly important, because initially, with the funding of the initial comprehensive cancer centers after the National Cancer Act, clearly the community cancer centers really needed that education and that collaboration and that cooperation and the relationship building between the major universities that were doing cancer research and treatment. How do you see community-based cancer care with respect to oncology nursing now?
Well, much of this has happened after I retired from surgery and standing back looking at it. But there's never been any doubt growing up in Iowa, as I did, with hospitals of 20, 30 beds. I was lucky to be born in Cedar Rapids in a major hospital, but I know that throughout America, people need medical care and, in that sense, cancer care close to home. Further out west, as you are now, people can often drive for many hours just to reach a cancer center, community cancer center, to reach a comprehensive cancer center, such as at Memorial Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson, would be impossible. So the idea of developing physicians and radiation therapists and nursing oncologists who can do the job close to home is terribly important. Otherwise, they just don't get treated. We now on Indian reservations and poor people, they don't get treated even though they're close to care. There has to be a continued reaching out to find people who either can't afford it, can't talk about it. We have to reach them. And community cancer centers are certainly a crucial part of that.
When we were thinking about starting ONS, and I know in the very beginning, there was the question of should it be under the American Cancer Society? Should it be under the American Nurses Association? And interestingly enough, we felt that it really should be an independent organization. It took us a while to get to that. And I'm very, very happy that it still remains somewhat autonomous in terms of its own specialty with its own certifications. When you look at oncology in general with all of the physician groups now, how do you see those organizations impacted by the Oncology Nursing Society? So in the reverse, in other words, ASTRO started, ASCO started, then ONS. Now you look at ONS. How do you feel that ONS now has an impact or an influence on large cancer organizations?
One of the really odd things is that surgeons were involved in cancer care before anybody else. And yet surgical oncology has never been recognized within the field of surgery as a board-certified specialty, even to this day. All surgeons, all general surgeons, believe that they are competent to take care of cancer. Some specialize in it and do a little more of it, and we all know that there are some who are better than others, some who are luckier than others, and some who specialize, but all general surgeons believe that they should be in one field, which is general surgery, and that there should be no separate field for surgical oncology. So medical politics plays a huge role. Healthcare politics also plays a huge role. And there's tension. There's no way to get away from it. And within organizations, there is also tension. I'm sure that there are disagreements within the ONS also. You don't look at things. You sit down at the National Cancer Advisory Board and argue about how to spend it, what to spend it on, how much to spend on immunotherapy, how much to spend on new research, how much to spend on rehabilitation, so forth. No easy solutions. The beauty in America is that we can sit down at the table and argue about these things and come to a conclusion which is perhaps not the best, but at least we've agreed upon it and we can go forward with that.
So you mentioned a very important treatment and evolution, and that's immunotherapy. And I look now in the past in terms of intralesional BCG that nurses were administering.
You remember our patient.
And I think about what, now when we look at targeted therapies and we're able to look at immunotherapy and we're able to look at tumor oncolysates, and really in the early 70s, we didn't call it immunotherapy per se. Tell me a little bit about what led to you thinking that BCG would be a form of treatment for melanoma.
Well, actually, although it wasn't called immunotherapy widely, fact was that I was interested in it personally as a medical student. There were reports in tumors in mice that they would respond to immune therapy, raised either as lymphocyte therapy or as anti-tumor therapy. And that was what I was doing at the National Cancer Institute, National Institutes of Health in the 60s. Not much came of it because it wasn't going anywhere. And then all of a sudden, there were little breakthroughs. And I don't remember who it was that suggested BCG would be useful for cancer. But it was at about the time that I was in St. Louis that somebody mentioned it, maybe Don Morton from the National Cancer Institute. And so we tried it on melanoma, and we did not have any complete successes, but we still remember that very brave young man probably in his 50s who had metastatic melanoma all over his body and a huge mass of them. And injection of BCG, they just melted away. They didn't all melt away, and eventually he relapsed and died. But it shows the power of BCG. Nobody understands how it works, but it also works for bladder cancer. And one of my cousins, a little older than I am, I think of her as an aunt, but she was my cousin, and she lived for an extra 10 years because her bladder cancer was injected with BCG, and until it finally metastasized, it worked. So immunotherapy is now here. Everything that ends with AB and a cancer drug is an antibody. Monoclonal antibodies have changed everything. I spent 6 months trying to find a monoclonal antibody, had to find a melanoma antigen in order to raise an antibody against melanoma. And the antibody therapy against melanoma is not raised against melanoma antigen, it's raised against antigens in general. Nobody, after all these years, 25 years, has been able to find a specific melanoma antigen that you can raise a specific melanoma antigen antibody against. Isn't that weird? It's still just off the edge of our hopes.
So back to oncology nursing, what do you think was the impetus for Dr. Durant and yourself? And I think of those leaders, Dr. DeVita, the National Cancer Institute directors, the head of the clinical operative groups. I recall their support, that was their influence in terms of ONS. What do you think led you as a physician at a major teaching university to be so supportive of oncology nursing?
Once again, it's my background in nursing that helped me do it, but it's what I saw at the University of Wisconsin, exactly how it could go, what each person on the team should do. Each had their own job. And there's no doubt that nurses in general have a different approach to a patient's family, than most physicians do. You and Peggy Nelson could handle patients their jobs. I knew that was going to be the case. I expected it, and it was. It's a different way of looking at things. I use my hands in surgery and so forth, but there's some things I cannot do as well as a trained nurse. Part of it is the gift of being a nurse. I don't have that gift. I have a gift to admire it, but I cannot do it. You can do it.
So what do you think the magic formula was in terms of the collaboration between nursing? And when I look back and look at Memorial Sloan Kettering and MD Anderson and Ellis Fischel and, the initial comprehensive cancer centers, I think that is worthy of a bit of a discussion in terms of how they were chosen and what factors nursing played in that.
The institutional role and the leader of the institution is so terribly important. The idea of doctors and nurses working together as a team was not something that would go in many institutions. The nurse was, yes, sir. And in England, of course, it's just the other way around. The doctor has to ask permission from the matron in order to come onto the ward. That's really interesting. I've worked with some English nurses in America, and I can understand. I appreciate that. That's wonderful. But within the institution, some institutions would never accept the idea that a nurse could be a member of the medical team, the healthcare team. So I credit the MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering with introducing that idea. Many hospitals would never do it, but you've succeeded.
And I think when we look at the University of Alabama, where Dr. Duran and Connie were, and then I look at some of the commonalities, even with Daryl and Dr. Gollum, when you look at the challenges and the barriers patients face in urban centers are often the challenges and barriers patients face in rural centers. Speaking of COVID, for example, where patients were in New York were trying to I was talking to the nursing director at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and she was talking about how many buses patients had to take to get to treatment versus in, for example, a rural state like Montana, where patients would have to travel 110 miles one way to get treatment, radiation therapy. So when you look at where cancer care is going in terms of access to care, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm an old guy. I'm a bystander now. I don't know, but I do know we got to talk about money. I remember one of my friends who was the head of American Society of Clinical Oncology. He came into the business meeting one day, and he said, "This circus is too much." He's talking about all the goodies that were laid out in the rooms for people to eat and enjoy and so forth, put out by the pharmaceutical industries to sell their drugs. And now we see, when I was at the Harvard Business School for a summer back in the 1980s, we learned that the healthcare business was going to be dominating American income. The disposable income that most people have now is gone. The pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry is a business that has gone beyond all expectations. And so it makes it difficult for me to predict what the future holds any more than I can predict for sure that the sun will rise tomorrow. But whatever. I do believe the sun will rise tomorrow, but I do not know where the breaks will come. Cancer care has gotten so expensive. It's understandable that it would be expensive because, for instance, the immunotherapy is targeted, individual. If I developed a specific antibody, I think there are probably several in melanoma, I'd have to take a patient's antigen and produce an antibody against that. That would require probably 10 or 15 people in the laboratory over a period of 10 weeks or so forth to produce drugs for that one person. How much would that cost? Oh, unbelievable. $1 million easily. So it's very difficult for me to predict the future when I see that the healthcare industry itself is out of control and that our opportunities are also there out of control. I do not know how to predict the future.
And with respect to the oncology nursing growth and development, I asked you earlier, how has it exceeded your expectations? Because I know that you had high expectations when we formed. So I know you avidly read your Clinical Journal of Oncology Nursing and you keep up with the oncology nursing literature. What are you thinking now in terms of what you believe our major accomplishments have been?
You're humane. You're humane in a way that I don't see in other medical specialties. I get my weekly journals from ASCO. I get my monthly journals, my daily blogs from the American College of Surgeons, and I read them, I pass them by. What I really love to see is what you have in your journals and what you're doing in nursing oncology. I am so proud to be a nurse oncologist, even though it's just an honorary. You have exceeded my expectations. My expectations were very high, but you have exceeded them in your society, and I'm really amazed and proud of it.
So where do you see the future lie for us? You said you couldn't predict the future, but when you look at what you believed in terms of the formation of ONS.
Because my second degree, of course, my 2 degrees were in history, and I'm a historian now. I'm writing books in history for the last 20 years on a whole variety of subjects, Thomas Edison, the Cold War, genealogy, and so forth. And one of the things, the reason I mention that historians don't predict history is because that's off limits. You may take a look at the present and comment on the present based on history, but you do not predict history. Since I'm a professional historian now, I have to stay away from that.
Well, I think you'll be very excited to see what happens with the ONS history.
I can see the trajectory of what ONS has done based on what Florence Nightingale started and what people before Florence Nightingale who didn't have the same kind of pizzazz and long lived. I mean, God, she lived 100 years old, right? And I've been to her hospital in Istanbul, Constantinople. So I admire the trajectory of nursing and of nursing oncology, and I believe that you will be there doing the right thing for patients long after everybody else has gone in weird directions. But nursing oncology will still be there taking care of patients in the right way.
In closing, Dr. Hill, I want to thank you so deeply for your time, your expertise, and your wisdom. And what kinds of things are you thinking about in terms of the establishment of the History Center and its impact? And the Oncology Nursing Foundation has given $31 million back to oncology nursing. So it's an organization that gives back to itself in perpetuity, if you will. So the establishment of the History Center, would you like to speak about that?
I am so thrilled to know that there's a history center being developed and that you will do that. As a professional historian after I retired from surgery, I am fascinated and a little depressed to see the number of websites that appear for universities and departments of medicine and surgery and so forth that say absolutely nothing about the history of the organization. I don't want to belittle them by pointing them out, but I can tell you that there's some very major universities and departments that say nothing at all about the history. They may even mention that they've been there for 80 years or something like that. But what happened is what happens today. They don't mention the previous chairs. They don't mention discoveries that have come from the universities, the interesting things over a period of time. So to do a history center, follow some examples that are good, and I could name them, but you can find them easily if you just keep looking. A lot of them are around Boston. They're good examples. Boston pays attention to history in ways that other places don't. Second thing, we were talking about relationships with our professions in other parts of the world, and particularly in Europe. And the American Association for Cancer Education is a good example, I think, of beginning to work with the European Association for Cancer Education closer and closer and closer with collaborative memberships, meetings overseas from time to time, and especially with the Canadian group, which is, of course, sort of partly European and partly American. And so the opportunity and the goal of working with people of like mind in other countries is well worth doing. And we also learn from them. Things that work in Europe, we can sometimes employ in the United States, and people in Europe, although they can't do everything that we do in America, we can work together. Don't have to believe that one is better than the other. And of course, it's very refreshing. Bordeaux wine and German beer.
Well, to the credit of the Oncology Nursing Society and other organizations, I think that we have a place at the table now, with oncology nurses now being on the National Cancer Advisory Board, on the Moonshot Initiative, on major organizations involved in cancer care. And I think that is a huge step in the right direction. There's a movement to try to really influence nursing representation on many boards, even school boards. And I remember when we were looking at the very beginning of ONS, we had to be rather myopic in terms of what our focus should be. And now we've evolved to the point where I think we're sophisticated enough and have that ability to function autonomously, yet collaboratively with so many other organizations. So in closing, Dr. Hill, do you have any other thoughts about this? I want to thank you again. Your wisdom is not unnoticed, and you bring tremendous value to the establishment of our historical roots.
How can I say anything other than thank you, Cindi? Thank you for saying that. Thank you for giving me a chance to look back and try to look forward. And good luck.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.